Hi there. Welcome back to the Middle East video blog. I'm Jay.
I'm Merve. Today, this is the second episode that we're doing, and we're going to be talking about Iran and the nuclear negotiations that went on.
So this is sort of my area of expertise. I've been studying Iran for a couple years now. I'm by no means an expert, but I definitely know a lot. So we figured it'd be most helpful if we structured this episode more of like a Q&A. So Merve is going to ask me some questions about the negotiations after she establishes the background. We're going to look at some clips to get a sense of where both sides came into this negotiation from. And then I'm going to just start talking and hopefully...
And we'll talk about how we can assess what happened and how we can look at our future options. So basically a little bit of background here. There were, between November 7th and 10th, in Geneva, there were nuclear talk negotiations were held. This happened between Iran and the P5 members, which is the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. These nations are the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus 1. We call this P5 plus 1, the plus 1 being Germany was also involved. And so they had these negotiations to see, to reach a deal for Iran's nuclear program and the sanctions and see where they could come. This has been going on for a long while. As you know, there have been a lot of sanctions against Iran, and this has been a long-awaited issue that everyone wants to be resolved. And both sides were very optimistic going into this. In fact, Foreign Minister Zarif had said that they thought this past week, during the negotiations, they were actually waiting that the deal could have been achieved. Secretary Kerry also expressed similar thoughts.
And I think the British were arguably the most optimistic of all.
Yeah,
we have some clips of all those people speaking. Why don't you take a look?
Here are the negotiations having started.
Today we need to start putting it on paper so that we have a draft, a joint draft, not 2 separate drafts that we will start negotiating over, but a joint draft.
I want to emphasize there are still some very important issues on the table that are unresolved. It is important for those to be properly, thoroughly addressed.
A wide number of issues have been satisfactorily addressed. The atmosphere of these negotiations, as others have told you before, is completely different from the atmosphere of a few months ago.
Yet a deal was not reached. In fact, these talks were deemed a failure both in the West, all the P5 members, and in the Iranians' perspective. The negotiations will, however, continue on November 20th, and we'll sort of look at why these were a failure and what happened there and what can we expect for November 20th. So, Jay, before we start talking about what happened there at the negotiations, I want to talk about going into the negotiations. So the 3 key players we can say that we had here were the United States, obviously, Iran, and of course Israel. So what were the red lines for these 3 key players? What was it that they could not accept and they absolutely wanted to have going into the negotiations?
Well, it's important to remember at the outset that Israel is not a part of these negotiations, and there's a very good reason for that. We'll talk more about that later, but it's important to remember that the key players are definitely the US and Iran, and Israel's outside of the room. They have views, and those views are heard by many people, but they're outside of the room. Mm-hmm. So inside of the room, United States, Iran. Iran very much says that they want everyone to accept that they have a fundamental right to enrich uranium. Mm-hmm. That's their line. That's their stance.
So this was definitely one thing that absolutely want
going in. Now, in a negotiation, things can change, compromises can be made, but going in, that was their red line. The Supreme Leader absolutely said so. The President said so. The Foreign Minister said so. Everyone in Iran who's in power says that's our red line. We need the right to enrich uranium. The United States' red line is that we need verifiable measures. We need international monitoring of your nuclear program. And we will not accept you having the ability to break out and get nuclear weapons. So that's an important but small distinction, or subtle distinction. No one is actually arguing that Iran should have nuclear weapons. Even the Supreme Leader of Iran says there's a fatwa against it, there's a religious edict, we will not have nuclear weapons. The question is, how close of capability can they get to it? And that's really where the debate is happening, and the US and Israel are saying that Iran cannot be anywhere near to having the capability of having these nuclear weapons.
But the red lines for the United States and Israel were very different. As we know, President Netanyahu Prime Minister Netanyahu was very upset after the negotiations. Here's a little clip of how he reacted to the Geneva talks.
I understand the Iranians are walking around very satisfied in Geneva, as well they should be, because they got everything and paid nothing, everything they wanted. They wanted relief of sanctions after years of a grueling sanctions regime. They got that. They're paying nothing because they're not reducing in any way their nuclear enrichment capability. So Iran got the deal of the century, and the international community got a bad deal. This is a very bad deal.
So how does the red line differ for the United States and for Israel going into the negotiations?
Well, I think fundamentally it's important to remember that Israel is a very tiny state, and they are within the range. Let's assume for a second that Iran did have nuclear weapons. Those weapons have to get put on a missile and then launched to a target. Israel is within that range. So for a small, tiny little country like Israel, it's a Jewish state, and the Jewish people throughout time have faced existential crises. The Holocaust is the obvious example, and that's by no means faded from memory. There are still Holocaust survivors today. So from that perspective, the idea that a nuclear bomb could hit their tiny little country, that's game over.
So for them, this is an actual existential threat should Iran actually obtain nuclear weapons capability.
Exactly. Assuming that Iran would use them. Now, that's not by any means guaranteed. And we can maybe talk about that
going
later.
in, the red line for Israel is different than the United States because
that situation that I just outlined of a bomb hitting your country and all of your people dying, that doesn't apply to the United States.
So it's not an existential threat to the United States?
Not in that sense. Even if Iran got the bomb tomorrow, it doesn't have the missile capability to hit America.
Okay. Yet it seems that keeping the Israeli and U.S. differences here sort of on the side, let's look at Iran and the U.S. It seems like there were a lot of differences in how they viewed Iran's capabilities going into negotiations, yet there was so much optimism. So I want to ask you, what was this optimism based on? What made us believe as the public, that a deal could actually be reached?
Well, the public is going to believe whatever they're going to believe. Let's focus on the officials and the diplomats and the people who are actually making these statements.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they actually believed that a deal could be reached.
Okay.
But it's important to say that you do. Because what's the alternative? You go into the negotiating room and all day in the media you've been talking about how you're not optimistic about how this is going to go. That's not really a good way to have a negotiation. The point is that these countries have been under serious tension and serious antagonism for 30 plus years. I mean, the Iran calendar dates back to 1953 when America and Britain, the CIA and the MI6, they overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. I mean, there's no debate about that anymore. Everyone agrees about that. So that's where the Iranian clock starts. The American clock of grievances starts in 1979, 1980. Aggressive overthrow of the Shah, one of America's preeminent allies in the region.
So there's huge grievances on both sides. So we're saying that trying to keep the rhetoric optimistic is going to build some confidence.
It's a tiny, small, little confidence-building measure that you can make that is at no cost to you. It literally costs you nothing, virtually nothing, to get on TV as the foreign minister of Iran or as the Secretary of State of America and say, we're optimistic going into these negotiations. We look forward to speaking to the other side. We feel like this is an opportunity that we can both seize, and we hope that we can come to an agreement.
But you think that the sides didn't really think that a deal could have been reached?
Maybe. I don't think in this round. I think everyone is very experienced that's in these negotiations. They know that it takes time. They know that they need to build confidence. And so this time around, I don't think anyone really believed that a deal was going to get struck. Maybe some did, but everyone in the back of their minds thought, okay, look, it might not happen this time. But this is just, it's all part of a dance. It's all part of a confidence-building dance. You can't erase 30 plus years of negative history in the span of 3 days.
So this is the general reason why the U.S. and the Iranians couldn't really agree. But let's talk about specifically what was it there that sides couldn't accept about this deal? Why wasn't it that the U.S. was able to give concessions? Obviously, both sides weren't able to give the concessions needed, otherwise they would have reached a deal. So what was it there that really...
My impression is that the Iranians, their red line was the unacceptable factor here. Was that when they were presented with the P5+1 plan, which essentially was this: that Iran, if they accepted, would agree to suspend enriching uranium for a period of, let's say, 30 to 60 days. And in that time period, UN inspectors would go in, they would attach all sorts of electronic monitoring devices, they'd have physical monitors there, people from the UN, to look at what's happening, get a full sense of what Iran's nuclear program is, and then at the end of that period, Iran could resume enriching, assuming that we had all the verifiable confidence-building measures in place. However, nowhere in that agreement did it state that Iran had a right to enrich uranium. And as we stated,
this was very important for
Iran, that was their red line. So if the deal doesn't include that, they're going to reject it, at least the first time around.
Okay, so but for Iranians, they also had an incentive, right? Because of the sanctions that were going.
Well, certainly have. There's a reason that they are at that negotiating table, and they will definitely benefit if they can reach a deal.
Yeah. So it seems like the sanctions have really hurt Iran. It seems like the consequences of these sanctions have been very dire on them. So
Absolutely.
so then why is it that they're still persisting on having this acknowledgement, this international acknowledgement that they have a right to pursue a nuclear program? Like, what does this mean for Iran? What does this nuclear program capability mean for Iran?
There are two answers to the question, and they're both important. The first is a broad, general, ideological reason. Iran very much sees itself as one of the great dynasties of the world.
And it is.
And it certainly is.
Mm-hmm.
And from their perspective, especially in the modern day, the rest of the world has turned its back on Iran. They've ignored Iran, and they've sold Iran short. From their perspective, no one recognizes Iran's historic achievements in science, in math, in astronomy, in poetry, in literature, even in things like the rule of law and democracy and constitution writing.
Mm-hmm.
They think that that Iran has a very bad name and that no one gives Iran the kind of credit that it's due. As a result, they look around and they see, well, what do all the great powers, everyone who has respect in the international stage, what do they have? A nuclear weapons program, or at the very least a nuclear program. For example, Germany. A lot of respect, big economy, great manufacturing, good engineering, and they have a nuclear program for energy, but not for weapons. And they're seen as pretty much respected on the international stage. So Iran basically wants to get on that, and so the first answer to the question is it's an ideological reason.
So it's that they want to be acknowledged as a power.
They see themselves as a superpower.
influence.
They see themselves as a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much everyone else acknowledges that America is the only one, and if there's another one, then maybe it's China. But the Iranians, you look at their rhetoric, and they very sincerely, some of them believe, no, we're a superpower. And we're just not being regarded as such. And if they can have this nuclear energy program, they think that they'll get that recognition.
Okay, so it's almost like a pride thing.
Absolutely, a civilization, people's pride, which I think Americans can kind of relate to. I mean, the idea that America's number one, patriotism, and loving for freedom and democracy and human rights. I mean, America knows what it's like to be a very proud people.
A lot of Republican rhetoric. Anyway, so this is the ideological component. So what else is there for Iran? What about strategic?
Right. So there's exactly that. So that was sort of the broad reason. Here's the specific reason. It's called in international relations theory the security dilemma. That in today's world, countries want to have autonomy over their own security. They want to know that they can act domestically especially and also internationally and in the foreign region, in their foreign realm, in their region. They want to know that they can act with autonomy, that they're not going to get bullied. Mm-hmm. They don't have to do automatically what someone else tells them to do just because that person is stronger, or that country rather. And again, look at history. When a country gets a nuclear program, be it weapons or even peaceful, all of a sudden it gains a certain amount of respect and also autonomy decision-making authority. It doesn't need to rely on other countries as much.
And it won't be bullied.
And it won't be bullied.
So who is bullying Iran?
Everyone. But I mean, especially America and Israel. And now Russia and China sort of support Iran, but not in the same way that America supports Israel, for example, which is why America and Israel have really led the world in these sanctions that have targeted Iran's economy, targeted their ability to get away with what they're doing, and really crippled their ability to act. And so because Iran feels so constricted, the grand irony here is that the whole reason for the sanctions is the nuclear program, but from their mind, they think maybe if we could just get it, all of a sudden we'd be free and we'd have that freedom to move.
But then what about North Korea? I mean, they have nuclear weapons, yet they are completely isolated in the world stage.
They have China, one of the world's largest economies, the fastest growing economy in the world, and they are supported by China. They don't face the same kind of existential threat that Iran faces from the sanctions. Because if the sanctions continue and if the economy keeps getting worse, the Iranian people will revolt.
Oh, so the existential threat for the government, you're saying?
Absolutely.
If the people revolt. Okay, I see. Why is it so unacceptable to us, to the West, to the United States? We obviously we know why it is for Israel, but why is it important for us that this is so... It's so difficult to accept Iran's right to have a nuclear program. What is at stake here, really?
There are a couple things. The one I want to focus on right now is the idea of America's credibility on the world stage. Now, those of you who follow international affairs will remember the last time, just a couple of months ago, the Syria chemical weapons incident. President Obama set a red line. He said they will not be allowed to use chemical weapons, and if they do, we're going in. And they did, and we didn't go in. Whenever America makes a promise and it doesn't follow up on that promise, that has ramifications across the world.
So it's a credibility.
It's a credibility issue. So let's put it this way, in very simple terms. If America allows Iran to get a nuclear weapons program, not a weapons program, but to get a nuclear energy program, all of our other allies will start to question whether or not we actually will protect them like we've promised to. So look at Japan, for example. Even though North Korea has this nuclear weapons program, Japan has agreed to not have an offensive military. The only military capability they have is defensive. It's
Why?
because America promised, we'll protect you. Because America has an interest in making sure that countries don't start developing all their own nuclear weapons programs, proliferation just because of
Yeah, I mean, proliferation is very important. If you think about it, why is Saudi Arabia so afraid? We've seen sort of in history that whenever a power or a party gets a nuclear capability, weapons capability, then immediately the adversaries go and they try to obtain theirs.
So there's mixed evidence, right? So if you look at Pakistan and India, that definitely happened. North Korea, Japan, South Korea, no. North Korea got it. The other two so far haven't gone for it.
Okay, so we do have mixed evidence, as we say, but some would say that the nuclear proliferation for this reason is a problem.
Because also, and it's also relevant to keep in mind that one of the important differences between Southeast Asia and the Middle East is that basically the world's oil is in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So
it's different stakes.
It's much higher stakes. The potential of nuclear weapons proliferation and a possible nuclear war where all of our oil is, that's a much different situation.
So then what about the theory that when there is nuclear proliferation, when when one party gets nuclear weapons and the adversary also gets nuclear weapons, there's what we have, the concept we call deterrence occurs. So
and
neither party uses their nuclear capability.
Right, and some call that nuclear peace. The evidence speaks for itself. When's the only time in history that a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb has actually been dropped?
Once.
That was in a situation when America was the only country that had nuclear weapons. And as soon as the Soviet Union got weapons, never again has a bomb
So
been
once
used.
there were two, and there was the threat of mutually assured destruction, what we call MAD, suddenly it was...
No one used it.
Deterrence,
No one's used it. Now that's not to say we haven't come close. Cuban Missile Crisis, a really good example. But the evidence is still the evidence, which is that a bomb has not been used in the era where more than one country has a nuclear weapon.
And many people were always saying, theorists say that, once a country, no matter how crazy we think the leader is, and how they're likely to use nuclear weapons if they get it, there's this theory that, these people almost moderate once they have such a huge power, and that's what we've seen. The United States thought, oh, the Russians, they're crazy. If this man gets nuclear weapons, they're definitely going to use it. Didn't happen. Chinese, oh no, we cannot have this happen. If they get it, they're going to use it. This man is crazy. Didn't happen. So maybe with Iran, the threat is not as bad as we think it is.
Because another way to think about mad is to think about, instead of pressing a button to send a nuclear bomb to your adversary, it's like pulling the trigger on a gun. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing that I think we can say about dictators, it's that they want to stay in power.
Mm-hmm.
So why would someone who wants to stay in power commit political and realistic suicide by firing a nuclear weapon?
And how do you think this is because of you're talking about the Iranians, the population's reaction should Iran get nuclear weapons and use it?
Yeah, I mean, there's the population's aspect, but even more so, the threat of mutually assured destruction. I mean, the history is very clear that when Israel feels threatened, it strikes. And if there's one thing we know about the Iranian government, it's that they like power, and they want to stay in power for as long as possible.
Is a deal likely to be reached at any point? So what can we expect from November 20th in the next round of negotiations, and in general, how likely are these parties to reach an actual deal?
I don't know about the likelihood of them reaching a deal. I will say that it's possible. I'll also say that if you think of it as almost a game of chicken, where on the one side, the longer the negotiations go on, potentially, if the Iranians are actually being very deceptive, the longer the negotiations go on, the closer they get to having nuclear weapons capability, or even some form of nuclear capability that's close to it. At the same time, the longer the negotiations go on, the longer the sanctions are in place. And the more
so both sides have something to fear. So both sides don't really want to stall this.
I know, and I think that Iran is in a weaker position. I think Iran suffering from the sanctions, that hurts them more than the potential of some sort of weapon or advanced nuclear program. I think the Iranian sanctions hurt them more. Look, again, they know how to stay in power, and in fact, they know how to throw a revolution. They did it in 1979. These are the exact same people who threw that revolution. They know what it looks and sounds like to be on the street and hear and see revolution coming. And in fact, they looked across the Persian Gulf and they looked at the rest of the Middle East, and they know when the price of bread gets too high, people revolt. And if the sanctions keep doing what they're doing, the Iranian economy is going to get worse and worse, and the likelihood of revolution is going to increase. The Iranian leaders absolutely know that, and they think they need a deal. They absolutely need a deal. So it's very possible that can be reached.
And how likely do you think it is for the United States or the other P5 members in Germany to sort of accept the Iranian position that it should be acknowledged that they have a right to a nuclear program?
I think it's realistic that we would acknowledge the right of them to have the right that they have to enrich uranium.
We all know that Israel is never going to agree on this.
But they'll deal. I think they'll deal. Political positions will change over time. I think the West will agree that Iran has the right to enrich uranium as long as they are comfortable and confident in the international monitoring that gets set up by the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Association.
How can we really trust that the Iranians won't continue to enrich their uranium in secrecy?
Well, this is the dilemma. Both sides have very little trust in one another.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, the past times when Iran tried to cheat, the sanctions their economy wasn't as bad.
Mm-hmm.
Their economy is much worse today. So their incentive to cheat is much lower. Furthermore, the West will never agree to a deal that they're not comfortable with. John Kerry already laid that foundation by saying no deal is better than a bad deal. And so if they don't think that the deal in place gives enough time to build confidence and put in those monitoring and verification systems so that way the international community can know at every single minute of every single day what the Iranian nuclear scientists are up to, if that's not in the deal, the West will never agree to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Iran can get on board with that if they are also given the right to enrich uranium. I think that's where the
So
common
after
ground-
6 months, let's say, so after all the inspection is done.
that just makes
Okay.
sense to me.
We hope you were able to answer some of the general questions that you might have about this process. And
Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
your support. And again, any ideas you have for future episodes, just email us at middleeastvideoblog@gmail.com. That's it for episode 2. I'm Jay.
I'm Merve.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Good night.